Before we begin this story, tell me in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is in your part of the world right now. I always love imagining these stories traveling across different cities, towns, and quiet little rooms where someone is listening with a full heart. There was a time when people in Westfordshire used to speak the name Eleanor Whitmore with admiration, envy, and sometimes fear. She was the kind of woman who did not merely enter a room, she altered its temperature. At 68, with silver blonde hair always pinned neatly at the nape of her neck and a posture so straight it seemed carved by discipline itself, Eleanor carried the unmistakable air of someone who had built her life with her own hands and never let herself forget the cost of it. But Eleanor had not been born into influence. Long before the Whitmore name came to be printed on polished hotel brochures and engraved on brass plaques beside the doors of elegant boutique properties across England and parts of continental Europe, she had been nothing more than the daughter of a railway clerk and a seamstress. She grew up in a narrow brick house with a leaking roof and curtains her mother patched 3 times a year. She knew what it was to count coins for supper. She knew the humiliation of wearing last winter's coat into spring because there was no money for a new one. She knew what it felt like to be clever but invisible in rooms where wealthy girls spoke too loudly and laughed too easily. At 21, she met Arthur Whitmore. Arthur was not rich then, not at all. He was the son of a small innkeeper from the countryside, a handsome young man with tired eyes, rolled-up sleeves, and impossible ideas about turning tired, forgotten inns into places that made people feel welcome and important at once. While others saw peeling wallpaper and weak plumbing, Arthur saw fireplaces, stories, candlelight, and possibility. Eleanor saw it too. "People don't pay only for a bed," Arthur had told her one evening as they stood in the shell of their first failing property, rain dripping through a broken corner of the roof. She had folded her arms and glanced around at the damped walls. "Then what do they pay for?" Arthur smiled, stepping closer. "They pay for the feeling that for one night life is more beautiful than usual." Eleanor had laughed softly then, but she never forgot it. They married young, worked impossibly hard, and suffered more setbacks than anyone later imagined when they looked at the polished version of their story. There were winters when they barely kept the heating on in their own home because every spare pound went into repairs, wages, or suppliers. There were nights when Eleanor slept in an office chair with invoices on her lap and a calculator in hand. There were years in which success seemed so delayed it felt like an insult. Then, gradually, the tide turned. 1 inn became 2, 2 became 4. Arthur's instinct for atmosphere and Eleanor's merciless discipline with numbers, staffing, contracts, and standards created something formidable. By their late 40s, the Whitmores were no longer surviving, they were expanding. Their small hospitality dream became Whitmore Collection, a respected chain of boutique hotels known for understated luxury, impeccable service, and heritage charm. And while the company grew, so did their family. Their first daughter, Vivian, was born during the leanest years. Eleanor still remembered checking payroll while in labor pains and refusing to leave the office until Arthur physically took the ledger from her hands. Vivian grew into exactly the sort of child Eleanor admired, immaculate, poised, clever, and sharp-tongued. Even as a girl, she hated disorder. At 18, she spoke of law school as though the world had been waiting for her arrival. Their second daughter, Celeste, came 3 years later, all golden curls and social ease. Where Vivian was steel, Celeste was silk. She knew how to smile at the right people, charm rooms, and make others feel chosen. Eleanor sometimes worried that Celeste cared too much for appearances, but Arthur would wave it off. "She's warm-hearted," he would say. "She's strategic," Eleanor would reply. Then there was Naomi. Naomi was born much later, when the company was already stable, and Eleanor, for the first time in her life, should have allowed herself softness. But softness did not come naturally to her. Naomi entered a household where standards were already fixed, expectations already towering, and the family name already carrying weight. As a child, Naomi was different from her sisters in ways Eleanor did not know how to appreciate. Vivian liked achievement. Celeste liked admiration. Naomi liked people. She would disappear from formal dinners to sit in the kitchen with the staff. She remembered the porter's birthday when her own mother forgot it. She sneaked blankets to an elderly groundsman sleeping in a cold annex after his wife died. When she was 12, Eleanor found her serving tea to a delivery driver who had twisted his ankle on the back steps. "That is not your concern," Eleanor had said sharply. Naomi had looked up, confused. He was in pain. There are employees for that. But they were busy. Eleanor's expression had hardened. "You are a Whitmore. Behave like one." Naomi said nothing then, but Arthur, who had witnessed the exchange from the doorway, later put a gentle hand on his youngest daughter's shoulder and murmured, "Never let kindness embarrass you." Those words would stay with her longer than anyone knew. As the girls grew older, Eleanor began to see in them what she believed the future required. Vivian had ambition and discipline. Celeste had grace and social intelligence. Naomi, however, seemed to drift farther from the mold expected of her. She did well enough in school, but cared little for prestige. She volunteered in community centers. She spent weekends helping at charity shops. She spoke to cleaners, drivers, receptionists, and kitchen staff with the same natural respect she showed to guests and investors. At first, Arthur smiled at it. Later, Eleanor feared it. "She has no instinct for rank," Eleanor complained one night after a fundraising gala, removing her earrings with clipped movements in front of the bedroom mirror. Arthur loosened his tie. "Perhaps that's not a flaw. It is if she is meant to carry the family name." Arthur turned toward her. "Eleanor, not every strength looks like yours, and not every softness survives in this world." Arthur was quiet for a moment. Then he said gently, "Perhaps the world would be less cruel if more people were like her." Eleanor did not answer. She never liked being reminded that compassion could also be a form of strength. Years passed, and the distance between Eleanor and Naomi widened in subtle, painful ways. Vivian entered London society and excelled. Celeste flourished in polished circles, seeming born for champagne receptions and old money conversation. Naomi attended university, but returned changed. Not rebellious in the dramatic sense, but settled in herself in a way Eleanor found unsettling. She spoke more plainly. She challenged assumptions. She seemed uninterested in climbing the ladders Eleanor had spent her whole life building. Then Arthur died. It happened quickly. A stroke, a hospital corridor, a family summoned too late to hear final words that might have mended things before they broke. His death hollowed the center of the Whitmore family, but Eleanor did not allow herself to grieve openly. Instead, she became harder, more efficient, more controlling. Without Arthur's quiet balance, the house changed. Vivian became more openly aligned with her mother's expectations. Celeste learned to avoid conflict while enjoying its advantages. Naomi, on the other hand, began pulling further away from the world Eleanor insisted upon. And then came Thomas Reed. He was a mechanic from a neighboring town, honest, broad-shouldered, unpolished, with rough hands and a calm voice. He had none of the credentials Eleanor respected. No pedigree, no strategic family, no polished speech. He repaired engines, wore worn jackets, and looked people in the eye without trying to impress them. Naomi loved him. When Eleanor first learned of the relationship, she thought it temporary, an act of grief, confusion, or youthful rebellion. But Naomi was not rebelling. She was choosing. They argued in stages at first. Controlled conversations turned into bitter debates. Eleanor offered Naomi a position within the company, a London flat, introductions, opportunities, anything that could steer her back into what she called a sensible future. Naomi refused each one. One evening, inside the drawing room of the Whitmore estate, the tension that had been building for months finally snapped. "You are throwing away everything your father and I built," Eleanor said, her voice low and cold. Naomi stood near the fireplace, pale but steady. "No, Mother, I'm refusing to live a life that feels borrowed." "Borrowed?" Eleanor repeated in disbelief. "You have been given every advantage: education, security, a name that opens doors." "And what if I don't want doors opened for me by a name?" Naomi shot back. "What if I want a real life?" Eleanor's eyes flashed. "Do not romanticize struggle. You have no idea what real hardship is." Naomi's face tightened. "Maybe because you worked so hard to make sure I never had to know it. But somewhere along the way, you forgot that comfort is not the same as love." For a moment, the room went still. Then Eleanor said the words she would later replay in sleepless silence for years. "If you choose a life beneath this family, then do not expect to remain part of it." Naomi stared at her, as though the sentence had struck her physically. Celeste, standing by the doorway, whispered, "Mother." Vivian said nothing. Naomi's voice, when it came, was trembling but clear. "So that's what you are to me? A stain to be removed?" "You are making your decision," Eleanor replied. Naomi swallowed hard, tears filling her eyes but refusing to fall. "No, you are." She left the estate with one suitcase. 10 years passed. In public, Eleanor never spoke of the disowned daughter. In private, she forced herself to think of Naomi as a self-inflicted wound, a chapter closed by necessity. Yet the silence did not erase anything. It merely aged beside her. And as the years moved forward, something more troubling began to grow in the beautifully arranged life Eleanor had protected so fiercely. A coldness in the family she still had. Vivian visited with expensive gifts and careful timing, but every conversation somehow drifted toward legal structures, succession plans, capital, or asset protection. Celeste arrived with kisses on both cheeks and charming stories from France, yet somehow always left after mentioning renovations, property questions, or what would happen eventually. With the estate portfolio, Eleanor began to notice how often affection arrived with calculation, how quickly concern turned practical, how strangely alone a woman could feel in a mansion full of portraits, staff, and polished silver. One rainy evening, sitting alone in Arthur's old study with a file of unfinished estate papers before her, Eleanor closed the folder and stared at the fire until the flames blurred. For the first time in many years, she allowed the truth to form fully in her mind. She had spent a lifetime building security, status, and legacy, but she no longer knew which of her daughters loved her, and which only loved what would remain when she was gone. Before we continue, tell me in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is there right now. I always find it moving to imagine this story reaching someone in a quiet room, a busy city, or a faraway town at just the right hour. For 3 nights after making her decision in Arthur's old study, Eleanor Whitmore barely slept. The conclusion she had reached should have brought her clarity, yet instead it filled her with a strange, unsettled dread. She had spent decades judging people quickly, efficiently, and often correctly in matters of business. She could tell within 10 minutes whether a manager was weak, whether a guest complaint was honest, whether a contract hid a trap. But this was different. This was not about employees, investors, or competitors. This was about blood, about the daughters she had raised, disciplined, protected, and, in Naomi's case, cast away. On the fourth morning, she summoned no lawyers, no advisors, and no daughters. Instead, she called in sick to a charity luncheon she had agreed to attend, canceled a property review in Bath, and instructed her housekeeper not to disturb her. Then she locked herself inside her dressing room and began what would have once seemed impossible for a woman like Eleanor Whitmore. She started to erase herself. From the back of a wardrobe trunk she had not opened in years, she pulled out old clothes from the earliest, poorest days of the hotel business: faded wool skirts, frayed cardigans, a shapeless brown coat with a lining nearly gone at the seams. These garments had once belonged to another version of her, the woman before success, before prestige, before she learned to armor herself in tailored elegance and self-command. She stared at them for a long moment. Then, with slow and deliberate hands, she changed into them. Her reflection began to shift in uncomfortable stages. She removed the pearl earrings Arthur had given her on their 20th anniversary. She took off the wedding band she still wore on a thin chain around her neck. She pulled every pin from her hair until the silver blonde style collapsed around her face. Then she brushed it roughly and flattened parts of it with a damp towel to make it look neglected. From an old theatrical kit left behind from one of the hotel's Christmas events years ago, she found dull powder and shadow enough to hollow her cheeks slightly and darken the skin beneath her eyes. When she finished, she no longer looked like the owner of Whitmore Collection. She looked like a woman who had been forgotten. The sight of herself made her stomach tighten. There was no glamour in poverty when one had known it closely, no romance in frayed hems, bad shoes, or hungry dignity. Eleanor knew that better than any of her daughters, yet even she had spent years creating distance between herself and that memory, as though class were a kind of moral safety that could never be reversed. That realization made her jaw clench. Had she done the same thing to Naomi all those years ago, dressed her judgment up as principle and called it wisdom? By noon, she had written out the first stage of her plan on cream stationery, then burned the note in the fireplace. She would visit each daughter separately. No warnings, no hints, no dramatic speeches. She would ask for something small enough that refusal could not be justified by danger, and personal enough that kindness would require inconvenience. A place to sit, a warm drink, shelter for one night. Not money. Money was easy. Real mercy cost comfort. The first journey took her to London. Vivian lived in Belgravia now, in a narrow but grand townhouse with black iron railings, expensive seasonal arrangements in the entry hall, and polished stone steps that glistened under the pale winter drizzle. Eleanor knew the house well. She had attended 2 Christmas dinners there, one engagement reception, and a birthday celebration where no one had laughed naturally once. As she approached the gate wearing her beggar's disguise, she felt something inside her recoil, not from the cold, but from the humiliation of what she was about to do. She was almost 70 years old, the founder of a respected hotel group, and she was about to stand outside her own daughter's home, pretending to be a stranger. But she kept walking. A young assistant opened the door first, neatly dressed and holding a tablet. Her expression changed immediately when she saw Eleanor's appearance. The young woman asked carefully. Eleanor lowered her gaze and roughened her voice. "I'm sorry to trouble you. It's very cold. I wondered if I might have a cup of tea and perhaps a dry corner to rest in for the evening, just the garage or a chair near the back if there is one." The assistant hesitated, uncertain. Before she could answer, Vivian appeared in the hallway, fastening one cuff of a tailored cream coat. She stopped when she saw the figure at the door. For one fleeting second, Eleanor searched her eldest daughter's face for instinctive compassion. She found irritation. "Who is this?" Vivian asked. "I think she's asking for help, ma'am," the assistant replied. Vivian stepped closer, but not too close. Her perfume reached Eleanor before any warmth did. "There's a council service for this sort of thing. You shouldn't come to private residences." Eleanor looked up with trembling hands she did not have to fake. "I don't need much, just one night inside from the rain." Vivian's eyes flicked once over the wet sleeves, the cracked shoes, the lined face. Then she sighed the way one does at a logistical inconvenience. "Amelia," she said to the assistant, "call the shelter line and have someone direct her, and please close the door. The car will be here in 2 minutes." Eleanor tried once more. "Please, I haven't eaten since yesterday." Vivian's expression hardened, though she kept her voice low enough to sound civilized. "I am not equipped to deal with this. There are services for people in your situation. You cannot simply appear at someone's home." Someone's home. Not your home, Mother. Someone's. Then, almost as an afterthought, Vivian opened her handbag, withdrew a crisp note, and held it out with the careful distance one might use for something unpleasant. "Here." Eleanor did not take it. The assistant looked uncomfortable, but Vivian's patience was thinning. "Honestly," she muttered, half to herself, "this is why the neighborhood is deteriorating. One person lets them linger, and suddenly they all start coming." The words struck Eleanor more sharply than the cold had. Not because they were cruel, though they were, but because the voice in them was partly familiar. The discipline, the disdain, the belief that compassion, if extended too far, invited contamination. Her own voice, refined over time and returned to her through her daughter. Without another word, Eleanor stepped back from the doorway. Amelia, the assistant, looked as though she wanted to say something kind, but Vivian was already turning away, adjusting her gloves, preparing for whatever immaculate engagement awaited her that afternoon. The black door closed. Eleanor stood for a moment under the rain, the iron railings cold beside her, and felt for the first time that this test might wound her more deeply than she had anticipated. She walked 3 streets away before she allowed herself to stop beneath an awning and breathe properly. Her chest hurt, not with illness, but with the ache of recognition. Vivian had not shouted, she had not laughed, she had not committed the obvious sins of cruelty that make judgment easy. No, her refusal had been composed, rational, respectable. That was what made it worse. A heart could be absent while manners remained intact. Eleanor returned to Westfordshire that evening in silence. The driver she had privately hired for discretion never asked questions. Back at the estate, she dismissed the staff early, sat alone in the breakfast room with untouched soup, and thought of Naomi. Not because she meant to go to Naomi yet, she had promised herself she would follow the order she had set, but because something in Vivian's response had reopened the oldest scar in the family. Eleanor suddenly remembered, with sickening clarity, the look Naomi had worn the night she was disowned. Not dramatic, not hysterical, simply shattered by the knowledge that love had become conditional. 2 weeks later, after refining her disguise further and waiting just long enough to avoid suspicion, Eleanor traveled to the south of France. Celeste lived near Nice, in a villa that seemed built more for photographs and for human life. Pale stone walls, climbing roses even in the cooler months, a long terrace overlooking water so blue it scarcely looked real. Eleanor had paid for part of the renovation as a wedding gift years earlier, after convincing herself that generosity could substitute for intimacy. When she arrived, there was already a small luncheon underway. Through the open terrace doors, she could hear laughter, clinking glasses, the lazy music of wealth at ease with itself. A maid noticed her first and hesitated, unsure whether to send her away quietly, but Celeste, hearing a disturbance, came gliding towards the entrance in a soft cream dress, beautiful as ever, one hand balancing a wineglass with effortless grace. Her face arranged itself into concern the moment she saw the poorly dressed older woman standing at the gate. "Oh, you poor thing," Celeste said, loud enough for her guests to hear. "Have you been out there long?" The performance was so smooth that for one dangerous second, Eleanor almost believed it. She lowered her head. "Not long, madam. I only wondered whether there might be somewhere I could stay tonight, even a servant's room. I can leave first thing in the morning." Celeste's smile changed. It did not vanish all at once, it simply stiffened at the edges, like silk drawn too tight. "A room?" she repeated softly. "I wouldn't be any trouble." Celeste glanced over Eleanor's shoulder, then back toward the terrace where two of her friends were clearly pretending not to watch. The calculation was nearly visible. Then Celeste reached into a small purse hanging at her wrist and withdrew a few folded euros. "Take this," she said. "There's a hostel in town." Eleanor did not move. "I don't need money. I just need one safe night indoors." Now the warmth disappeared completely. "I'm sorry," Celeste said, and the apology carried no apology at all. "That's not possible." "Please." Celeste lowered her voice. "You shouldn't come to private properties asking such things. It puts everyone in an awkward position." An awkward position. Again, that language of inconvenience, of preserving atmosphere, of helping only when help could remain tidy. Then Celeste turned to a security man near the side path and said in a tone meant to sound practical rather than cruel, "Make sure the gate stays shut after she leaves. We've had enough people wandering up from the road lately." The man nodded. Celeste pressed the cash toward Eleanor once more. "Take it and go on." Eleanor looked at her second daughter, at the flawless hair, the careful posture, the face that could still resemble tenderness when it wanted to, and understood something terrible. Vivienne's cruelty was efficient, Celeste's was decorative. She walked away from the villa without taking the money. By the time she reached the end of the road, the afternoon sun had turned sharp and bright against the sea, but she felt colder than she had in London rain. Both daughters had rejected her. Different styles, same emptiness. And far more unbearable than their behavior was the knowledge that she herself had laid part of its foundation. Because now, as she moved through airports and quiet train stations, through waiting lounges and lonely hotel rooms she paid for under a false name, Eleanor could no longer avoid the truth pressing at the back of her mind. Vivienne and Celeste had learned from her. The polished disdain, the instinct to sort human beings by usefulness, elegance, and disruption, the preference for controlled charity over intimate sacrifice, the belief that some lives were unfortunate but best kept at arm's length. Once, long ago, she had looked at Naomi's choices and called them beneath the family. Now she had watched her two admired daughters look at poverty and do the same. By the time Eleanor returned to England after France, winter had sharpened across the country. The estate looked stately and lifeless under a pale sky. She entered Arthur's study again, removed the wig, washed the powder from her face, and stared at herself in the mirror over the mantel. For the first time in years, success did not make her feel safe. It made her feel surrounded by proof of her own failures. She opened an old locked drawer in Arthur's desk and took out a thin folder she had not touched in almost a decade. Inside were private records, clipped updates, and one address that had long ago become outdated: Naomi. Her fingers rested on the page for a long while. Then Eleanor picked up the telephone and called a discreet investigator she had once used during a property dispute. "I need you to locate someone," she said. The man on the line asked for the name. Eleanor closed her eyes before answering. "Naomi Reed," she said softly. "My daughter." Before we continue, tell me in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is in your part of the world right now. There is something strangely comforting about knowing that a story like this can travel into so many different homes across so many different hours and still find the heart at the right moment. Naomi Reed lived in a town Eleanor had never once imagined visiting when she was younger. It lay in the north of England, in the kind of place people from old money often described with thinly disguised pity, an industrial town of brick terraces, narrow side streets, tired shop fronts, bus stops stained by weather, and a sky that always seemed to carry the memory of rain even when it was not raining. There were no long private drives here, no manicured hedges, no polished brass plates announcing heritage names. The houses stood shoulder to shoulder, practical and plain, as if life had taught them not to expect decoration. 3 days after her call to the investigator, Naomi received Eleanor's address. She had sat alone at Arthur's desk while the man explained the basics in a discreet, professional tone. Naomi had married Thomas Reed, had lived modestly for years, had not maintained contact with anyone from the Whitmore's side of the family, and had been widowed 3 years earlier after Thomas died in an accident on a winter motorway. She had one son, Oliver, aged 12. She worked evening shifts at a pharmacy and occasionally picked up extra hours at a care home when money was tight. She rented a small flat above a bakery on a side street near the town center. There were no signs of scandal, debt collectors, criminal trouble, or hidden luxury. Only struggle, only effort, only a quiet life held together without complaint. When the investigator finished, Naomi remained still for a long while, the receiver in her hand growing warm against her palm. Widowed. The word landed late and hard. Naomi had lost her husband, and no one had told Eleanor because Eleanor had made herself unreachable to that part of her daughter's life. There had been a funeral somewhere years ago, strangers gathered around a coffin, and her own child had stood in black beside it, without a mother at her shoulder. Eleanor pressed a hand against her mouth. For the first time since beginning the test, she was not thinking about inheritance, proof, or even moral judgment. She was thinking about absence, her own, enormous and unforgivable. Still, she forced herself to continue with the plan. If she arrived as Eleanor Whitmore, the whole moment would be poisoned before it began. Naomi would see only the mother who had rejected her, not the stranger in need. Eleanor had come this far for truth, and truth required that she knock first as no one at all. So, on a bitter Thursday afternoon, wrapped once again in the frayed coat and worn shoes of her disguise, she took the train north with a small canvas bag and her heart beating harder than it had outside either Vivian's townhouse or Celeste's villa. With them, she had expected disappointment. With Naomi, she feared something else entirely. She feared justice. By the time Eleanor reached the town, daylight was already fading into the kind of early winter dusk that made everything look lonelier than it truly was. The air smelled faintly of chimney smoke and damp stone. Shopkeepers were pulling half doors inward and switching signs from open to closed. A butcher hosed down the pavement outside his shop. A young mother hurried past with a pram and a tired child asking for crisps. Life here was ordinary, unadorned, and honest, in a way that struck Eleanor more deeply than she expected. The address led her to a narrow row of buildings above small businesses. The bakery downstairs was just closing, and warm light glowed through the window, carrying with it the smell of bread, sugar, and butter. Beside it, a worn blue door opened to a steep staircase leading to the upper flats. Eleanor stood across the street for nearly 2 minutes, staring. She had imagined this moment while planning the test, yet standing there now, she felt something close to panic. What if Naomi recognized her instantly despite the disguise? What if she did not recognize her but sent her away, not from cruelty like the others, but from exhaustion or caution? What if Oliver opened the door first? What right had Eleanor to appear in this child's life, even as a stranger, when she had denied him the dignity of a grandmother for 12 years? Her gloved fingers tightened around the handle of the canvas bag. She could still turn back. She could return to the station, go home, tear up the will, and live out the rest of her life with her uncertainty intact. But then a memory rose in her with startling force. Naomi, at 14, standing in the hotel kitchen, with sleeves rolled up helping a scullery maid clean spilled soup from the floor because the woman's arthritis was flaring in her hands. "You'll ruin your blouse." Eleanor had snapped then. Naomi had looked up and said simply, she needed help. It was such a small memory, and yet it steadied Eleanor now. She crossed the road. The staircase smelled faintly of flour, old paint, and radiator heat. On the second landing, she saw the number from the investigator's file painted in slightly chipped brass. Behind the door came the muffled sound of movement, then a kettle beginning to rumble somewhere inside. A television murmured quietly. For one strange second, Eleanor imagined the life beyond that door in a single, devastating rush. School bags slumped by the wall, laundry drying by a heater, cheap groceries carefully portioned, tired evenings, repaired furniture, grief folded into routine. She lifted her hand and knocked. There was a pause, then footsteps. When the door opened, Eleanor's breath nearly left her. Naomi had changed, of course. Time had touched her. At 38, she no longer had the bright, effortless softness of youth, but something deeper and more moving had settled into her face. Her features were leaner now. There were shadows beneath her eyes and the faintest beginnings of lines at the mouth and brow, the kind etched not by vanity, but by worry, responsibility, and endurance. Her dark hair, once always glossy and loose down her back, was tied up carelessly. She wore a simple gray jumper with the sleeves pushed to her elbows and dark trousers dusted faintly with flour, perhaps from the bakery downstairs or some hurried dinner preparation. Yet Eleanor knew her instantly. Not because of her face alone, but because of the way she looked at the world when she first opened the door. Alert, cautious, and immediately human. "Yes?" Naomi asked, one hand still resting on the knob. Eleanor lowered her head and roughened her voice, forcing herself not to tremble. "I'm sorry to trouble you. I was told there might be a church shelter nearby, but I can't seem to find it. It's getting dark. I wondered—" she swallowed. "I wondered whether there might be somewhere I could sit for a little while, just until I know where to go." Naomi did not answer at once. She looked at the older woman from coat hem to lined face, taking in the cold, the tiredness, and the uncertainty. Then she opened the door wider. "Come inside," she said. The words were so immediate, so free of calculation, that Eleanor nearly broke then and there. "Oh, no," she murmured weakly. "I wouldn't want to impose." "You're not imposing," Naomi said, already stepping back to make room. "It's freezing out there. Please, come in before you catch your death." The flat was small, very small compared to any place Eleanor had lived in the past 40 years, but it was clean and warm in the way a loved place becomes warm even when money is short. The sitting room and kitchen seemed to share one narrow space. A second-hand sofa with a knitted throw faced an old television. Books were stacked in tidy piles against a wall. A school blazer hung from the back of a chair. Near the radiator stood a drying rack with socks, a child's shirt, and one worn bath towel clipped in place. The kitchen counters were narrow but spotless, with a half-cut loaf, a chipped blue mug, and a saucepan already warming on the stove. Everything about the place spoke of care without abundance. Naomi shut the door behind her and glanced at Eleanor's wet shoes. "Would you like to sit by the heater?" Eleanor nodded mutely. "Here," Naomi said, guiding her gently toward a chair near the radiator. "I've just put the kettle on. Tea, or would soup be better?" "Tea is more than enough." "I've got vegetable soup, too. It's not fancy, but it's hot." That word again, not fancy. Naomi did not say it bitterly or apologetically. She said it as a fact, without shame. As the kettle hissed, a boy's voice floated from the back room. "Mum, is that you?" Naomi glanced toward the hallway. "Yes, love. Stay where you are a moment." A few seconds later, Oliver appeared anyway. He was tall for 12, thin in the way children of careful households often are, with dark hair falling over his forehead and a school workbook tucked under one arm. He looked first at Naomi, then at the strangers seated by the heater. There was no fear in him, only curiosity. "This lady was outside in the cold," Naomi explained gently. "She's warming up for a bit." Oliver nodded at once, as if this were not strange at all. "Do you want my blanket?" he asked Eleanor. "The thick one's in my room." Eleanor stared at him. For a heartbeat she saw Arthur, some echo of his instinctive kindness, stripped of polish and handed down through the daughter she had cast out. "Oh," she said softly, forgetting to roughen her voice for the first time. "No, dear, I couldn't take your blanket." "It's fine," Oliver replied with a shrug. "I've got another one." Naomi gave him a small, tired smile. "Let me sort it, Ollie. Have you finished your science revision?" "Nearly." "Then nearly isn't finished, is it?" He gave a resigned half-grin and disappeared back down the hallway. Naomi turned back to the stove. There was no performance in any of this, no looking over her shoulder to see who might be watching, no social benefit to be gained, no inheritance at stake. Only a tired woman, a small flat, and a door opened because someone was cold. When Naomi returned with a bowl of soup and a mug of tea on a tray, Eleanor's hands shook as she accepted them. "Thank you," she whispered. Naomi sat on the edge of the sofa across from her. "You don't have to thank me like that. I've troubled you. You needed help." The simplicity of it nearly undid Eleanor. For a few minutes they sat in the quiet clink of spoon against bowl, the radiator tapping softly as it heated, the kettle cooling on the stove. Eleanor had rehearsed practical answers in case she was questioned, but Naomi did not interrogate her. She did not ask for proof, a history, or reasons to justify mercy. She asked only whether Eleanor had any family nearby. Eleanor looked into the steam rising from her soup. "Not nearby," she said carefully. Naomi nodded as though she understood loneliness better than most. "That happens." A little later, after Oliver had finished his schoolwork and come back into the room, Naomi fetched an old but freshly laundered sweater from a drawer and held it out. "It belonged to my husband," she said quietly. "It's clean, and it'll be warmer than that coat." The sentence struck like a blade wrapped in gentleness. My husband. Past tense. Said without drama because grief had already become furniture in this house. Eleanor took the sweater with both hands. "You're very kind." Naomi's expression changed then, only slightly. It was not pride, it was not false modesty. It was something more complex, almost sad. "I try to be," she said. As night settled over the town and the bakery below finally went silent, Naomi made up the sofa with a folded blanket and a pillow Oliver insisted on contributing despite her protests. Eleanor watched them move around the little sitting room together, mother and son, tired but practiced, gentle with one another in the unremarkable choreography of a household held together by love rather than ease. There, in that cramped flat above a bakery, with soup still warm in her stomach and her dead son-in-law's sweater in her lap, Eleanor Whitmore understood with terrible clarity that she had reached the one daughter she had never deserved. And yet, Naomi had opened the door anyway. Before we continue, tell me in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is in your part of the world right now. Stories like this always feel even more alive when you imagine them reaching someone miles away, in another city, another country, another hour, but with the same kind of ache in the heart. Eleanor did not sleep much that night on Naomi's sofa. The flat was quiet in the honest way modest homes often are after long working days. The pipes gave the occasional soft knock. A draft whispered once beneath the old window frame before settling. Somewhere in the back room, Oliver turned in his sleep. Naomi rose just after dawn for work preparation, and Eleanor, pretending to remain asleep beneath the blanket, listened to the subtle sounds of her daughter's life before sunrise. Cupboard doors opening carefully, a kettle filling, a lunch being packed, the washing machine started on a short cycle, a shirtshiren ironed quickly on the kitchen counter because there was no time and probably no space for a proper ironing board. There was no idle comfort in this home. Everything was earned by effort. For the first time in years, Eleanor felt not merely ashamed of the daughter she had disowned, but frightened by how little she truly knew of the woman Naomi had become. She had imagined struggle, yes, but not this quiet, relentless endurance, not this life built without complaint and without any of the safety nets Eleanor had once considered indispensable. When Naomi left for her morning errand downstairs at the bakery and Oliver had not yet come out from the small bedroom, Eleanor sat upright on the sofa with the blanket still around her shoulders and realized there would never be a good moment to reveal herself. There would only be a true one. Her hands trembled as she reached up and slowly removed the gray wig that had helped age and distort her face. Without it, her own carefully pinned silver hair, flattened and disguised though it was, began to show itself. She went to the small mirror hanging near the hallway and wiped away as much of the dark powder and fatigue shadow as she could with a damp flannel she found near the sink. By the time Naomi returned upstairs carrying a paper sack of bread and 2 reduced-price pastries for Oliver's school snack, Eleanor was standing in the middle of the sitting room in her worn coat, stripped only partly of the mask. Naomi closed the door behind her and looked up. At first she frowned in confusion, not understanding what had changed. Then her eyes rose fully to Eleanor's face. The color drained from them. The paper bag slipped from Naomi's fingers and landed softly against the floor, bread rolling halfway out but neither woman noticing. For several long seconds neither of them spoke. Then Naomi whispered, "No." It was not disbelief alone, it was dread. Eleanor tried to say her name, but her throat tightened around it. "Naomi?" Naomi stepped backward as if instinctively protecting herself from a blow. "No," she said again, louder this time. "No, don't." There was such raw horror in her voice that Eleanor felt it in her bones. "I know how this looks," Eleanor began, her own voice breaking. "How this looks," Naomi repeated, staring at her as though the room itself had become unsteady. "You came into my home like this? You sat here. You ate here. My son spoke to you. I gave you—" She stopped, unable for a moment to continue. "You let me believe you were a stranger. I needed to know." Naomi let out a short, disbelieving sound that was almost a laugh and almost a sob. "Needed to know what? Whether I was still poor enough to be kind? Whether the daughter you threw away had become lowly enough to pass your test?" "Naomi, please." "No." Her whole body seemed to stiffen with old pain breaking open all at once. "You do not get to stand in this room and ask me for calm, not after what you did." Eleanor took one step forward, then stopped when Naomi flinched. That flinch nearly undid her. "I deserve your anger," Eleanor said quietly. "I know I do." "You don't know," Naomi shot back. "You don't know anything. You weren't there when Thomas died. You weren't there when I had to tell Oliver his father wasn't coming home. You weren't there when I chose between heating and groceries, when I sold my wedding earrings to cover rent, when my son had pneumonia and I sat up all night terrified because I couldn't afford to miss another shift." Her eyes filled, but she refused to look away. "And now you come here in disguise? You make me into some moral examination?" Every word struck clean and deserved. Eleanor's hands hung helplessly at her sides. "I did have no right to do it." "Then why did you?" "Because I was proud, because I was lonely, because I feared my other daughters no longer loved me, because I have lived too long mistaking control for wisdom." The answers came fast inside her, but she forced herself to say them plainly instead of hiding behind noble language. "Because I was afraid," Eleanor said quietly. "Afraid I had raised a family without love in it. Afraid that everything I built had made all of us hard. And because," her voice faltered, "because I have been a coward about you for 10 years." Naomi stared at her, tears now shining openly. "So you thought pretending to be destitute was courage?" "No," Eleanor said. "It was desperation." That word landed differently. Naomi did not soften, not yet, but something in her expression changed from pure shock to wounded comprehension. Eleanor saw it and continued before pride could ruin honesty again. "I went to Vivian first," she said, "then to Celeste." Naomi's jaw tightened. "What does that have to do with me?" "They turned me away." Naomi looked down briefly, as if she had expected nothing better, and did not find that surprising enough to matter. "I thought their refusal would be the worst of it," Eleanor went on, "but it was seeing myself in them that made it unbearable. The distance, the politeness without mercy, the instinct to keep suffering outside the gate. I heard my own lessons in their voices, my own pride, my own cruelty." Naomi gave a bitter, tired smile. "At least someone learned what you taught." The remark cut deeply because it was true. Eleanor lowered herself slowly into the chair by the radiator, suddenly feeling every one of her years. "I am not here to defend myself," she said. "I cannot defend what I did then or what I have done now. I can only tell you the truth. I was wrong about Thomas, wrong about the life you chose, wrong about what makes a person worthy. And when your father died, I became even worse than I already was." At the mention of Arthur, Naomi's face softened only in grief, not forgiveness. "He would have hated all of this," she whispered. "Yes," Eleanor said, with quiet devastation. "He would have." Silence settled between them, but it was no longer the stunned silence of revelation. It was the heavier silence of two women standing inside the wreckage of choices made years apart and now forced into one room. At last, Naomi wiped her face with the heel of her hand and said, "Oliver must not come out to this." Eleanor nodded immediately. Naomi drew a long breath and turned toward the hallway just as Oliver's bedroom door opened an inch. "Mum?" Naomi straightened. Her voice, when she answered, was controlled by sheer will. "Everything's fine, love. Finish getting ready for school." Oliver looked from his mother to the older woman in the room, sensing something strange but not yet understanding it. "Is she leaving?" "Yes," Naomi said after the slightest pause. "We're just talking." He nodded uncertainly and retreated again. The door clicked shut. Naomi sat down across from Eleanor, not close, not welcoming, but no longer sending her out. "Say what you came to say," she said. So Eleanor told her everything. She told Naomi about Arthur's study, about the decision to test the daughters, about Vivian's assistant and the shelter line, about Celeste's pretty cruelty at the gate in Nice, about the cold recognition that all her life she had rewarded control, polish, and ambition while undervaluing compassion, until compassion no longer knew how to live in most of her children. Naomi listened without interruption, her face pale and unreadable, except for the occasional tightening around the mouth. When Eleanor finished, she said only, "And now what? You discovered I'm not a monster, so what happens next? Do I receive a certificate? A revised opinion?" The sarcasm was deserved, but beneath it Eleanor heard something more fragile: fear of being emotionally handled again. "I don't want to revise an opinion," Eleanor said. "I want to repair what I destroyed, if such a thing is still possible." Naomi laughed once under her breath, but there was no humor in it. "You don't repair 10 years with one confession." "I know." "You don't become my mother again because you finally noticed I had a soul." "I know that too." Naomi stood and crossed to the window, folding her arms tightly against herself. Outside, the street below had begun its morning bustle: a van unloading flour sacks, a cyclist weaving past a delivery lorry, someone laughing near the bakery entrance. Normal life continued, while inside the flat above, the past stood exposed. After a long while, Naomi said without turning, "Do you know what hurt most? It wasn't the money, it wasn't the house, or the name, or even being cut out of the business. It was that you looked at the man I loved and decided that by loving him, I had made myself less." Eleanor shut her eyes briefly. "I know." Naomi finally turned back. "No, you understand it now. That is not the same thing." Again, true. By the time Oliver had gone to school and the worst of the morning rush downstairs had passed, Naomi had not forgiven her. Eleanor had not expected that and had no right to, but Naomi also had not thrown her out. That in itself felt like grace. "Stay until this afternoon," Naomi said, at last, exhaustion replacing fury for the moment. "I need time to think before I decide what to do with you." The phrasing was almost absurd, "what to do with you," but Eleanor accepted it humbly. Over the next several weeks, the relationship did not heal in one dramatic sweep. It changed in painfully small increments. Eleanor rented a modest cottage nearby rather than force herself further into Naomi's space. She paid, discreetly, and only after insisting, the overdue balance on Naomi's broken car repairs. Not luxury, only necessity. She covered Oliver's school trip fee when Naomi admitted he had been pretending not to want to go because he knew money was tight. She arranged nothing grand, made no public gestures, and did not once mention inheritance. Instead, she showed up. She sat in waiting rooms, she helped with groceries, she learned how Oliver took his tea, which football team he followed, and how he pretended not to like reading while secretly devouring adventure novels under a blanket with a torch. She accompanied Naomi one evening to the chemist after a late shift and watched customers greet her with the kind of trust money cannot buy. Slowly, Naomi let her witness the life she had built. Not because forgiveness had arrived, but because distance no longer could. And then, a month after the revelation in the flat, Eleanor made a decision that would force the rot in the family fully into daylight. She called for a formal gathering at Whitmore House. The stated reason was simple: estate planning, business succession, and family matters requiring all daughters present. Vivian arrived first, immaculate in charcoal wool, briefcase in hand, already speaking as though she expected paperwork and reason to govern the day. Celeste came shortly after, elegant as ever, wrapped in pale cashmere and air-kissing the housekeeper before asking whether lunch had been kept light because she had a dinner in London later. Neither woman expected to find Naomi standing beside the long drawing-room window when they entered. The room seemed to harden around the shock. Vivian stopped dead. Celeste's smile vanished. Naomi, dressed plainly in a navy dress and low heels, held herself with a quiet composure Eleanor had once mistaken for weakness. "What is she doing here?" Vivian asked first. Celeste recovered enough to say, "Mother, surely this is not some emotional ambush." Eleanor, seated upright in Arthur's old armchair, looked at all three of her daughters in one line and understood that whatever came next would either finish the family as it had been or finally tell the truth about it. And this time she intended not to hide behind silence. Before we continue to the final part of this story, tell me in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is there right now. There is something beautiful about knowing that even stories about heartbreak, pride, and forgiveness can find their way into so many different lives, in so many different corners of the world, at exactly the moment they are needed. The silence in the drawing room after Vivian's question did not feel like ordinary silence. It felt like the kind that comes just before glass breaks. Eleanor remained seated in Arthur's old armchair, her hands resting on the carved wooden arms, her expression composed in a way that only those who knew her well would recognize as dangerous. Naomi stood near the window, not defensive, not triumphant, simply present. She had not come to reclaim a throne. She had come because Eleanor had asked her to stand in the truth with her, and after weeks of painful conversations, cautious honesty, and a closeness rebuilt brick by fragile brick, Naomi had agreed. Vivian was the first to move. She set her briefcase down on a side table with more force than necessary and looked from Naomi to Eleanor with contained disbelief. "Mother, I assume there is an explanation for this." "There is," Eleanor said calmly. Celeste gave a thin smile that did not reach her eyes. "I certainly hope so, because if this is some sentimental exercise, I would prefer we not waste an entire day on theatrics." Naomi's expression did not change, but Eleanor saw her shoulders tighten ever so slightly. For years, she had been the one expected to absorb the smallest humiliations without protest. Not anymore, Eleanor thought. "This is not theatrics," Eleanor replied. "Sit down, both of you." Something in her tone, old authority sharpened by new purpose, made even Vivian hesitate before obeying. Celeste sank onto the end of the sofa, arranging her coat with a brittle elegance. Vivian took the chair opposite Naomi and crossed one leg over the other, prepared perhaps for a negotiation. What neither of them expected was confession. Eleanor told the story from the beginning. She described the decision in Arthur's study, the disguise, the London rain outside Vivian's townhouse, the shelter line, the note held out as substitute for inconvenience. She spoke without embellishment, which made it worse. Then she described Nice, the gate, the luncheon guests, Celeste's smiling concern evaporating the moment real sacrifice was asked for, the security instruction, the money offered as dismissal. By the time she finished, the room was very still. Vivian's face had gone pale, but only with anger. "You turned up at my home disguised as a beggar, and you expect me to treat that as reasonable behavior? You expect to recognize what you revealed, Eleanor said. What I revealed, Vivian repeated sharply, is that boundaries exist for a reason. Women living alone in London do not simply invite strangers into their homes. That is not cruelty, it is prudence. Celeste leaned forward at once, seizing the logic offered by her sister. Exactly. This is absurd, Mother. You manufactured a situation designed for us to fail. Naomi let out a faintest breath through her nose, not quite a laugh, not quite contempt. Celeste turned toward her. And you needn't look so sanctimonious. We all know you've always enjoyed playing the morally superior one. Before Naomi could answer, Eleanor spoke. No, she said, and the word landed like a slap. You do not get to speak to her that way in this house. It was the first time in years that Eleanor had publicly defended Naomi against her sisters, and the shift in the room was immediate. Vivian's eyes narrowed. So that's what this is. You've already chosen. I have chosen truth, Eleanor said. And that truth is unpleasant for all of us, most of all for me. Then, for the first time in front of all three daughters together, Eleanor admitted what she had spent years refusing to say aloud. I raised you to admire success, she said. I taught you to be polished, effective, cautious, and impressive. But somewhere along the way I failed to teach two of you that a human being can be poor without being lesser, needy without being dangerous, and inconvenient without being disposable. The words hung there. Celeste rose abruptly to her feet. That is grotesquely unfair. Is it? Eleanor asked. Yes. Celeste's voice shook now, not with sadness but with outrage. You speak as though we are monsters. We have lives, responsibilities, homes, reputations. We are not social workers. No one asked you to become social workers. I asked whether you had enough humanity left to offer one frightened older woman a chair, a cup of tea, one safe night. The answer was no. Vivian stood as well, her self-control fraying invisible edges. And what exactly is Naomi being rewarded for? Poverty? Sentiment? Giving shelter to a stranger because she lacks judgment? Naomi finally spoke, and her voice was quiet enough to force everyone to listen. No, she said. I'm not being rewarded for anything. That's the difference between how you think and how I live. Vivian turned toward her with open hostility now. Oh, spare me. Naomi met her gaze. You want to know why I let her in? Because it was cold, she was old, and she needed help. I didn't do a cost-benefit analysis. I didn't wonder how it would reflect on me. I didn't stop to ask whether kindness would inconvenience my evening. Celeste folded her arms tightly. Easy to say when you have nothing to lose. That did it. A silence followed, and this time it did not belong to Eleanor. It belonged to Naomi. When she answered, there was no raised voice in it, which only made it more devastating. Nothing to lose, Naomi said. I lost my father. I lost my mother while she was still alive. I lost the home I grew up in, the name that was supposed to protect me, the inheritance everyone assumed mattered more than love. Then I lost my husband. I have spent the last 12 years building a life out of what remained, so don't tell me I have had nothing to lose. Celeste looked away first. Vivian said nothing at all. Eleanor drew in a slow breath. The reckoning had begun, but she still had one more truth to lay on the table, the practical one, the one both elder daughters had cared about for years. My will has been rewritten, she said. Both heads snapped toward her. Vivian recovered fastest. Without consulting legal counsel, I hope not. Eleanor almost smiled at the predictability of that answer. With excellent legal counsel, actually, better than your own. Celeste's face tightened. Mother, I am not leaving Whitmore Collection as a prize for proximity, polish, or entitlement. Nor will I permit the family fortune to continue feeding the worst instincts in this family. Vivian took a step forward. This is emotional blackmail disguised as estate planning. No, said Eleanor. It is estate planning finally informed by character. Then she explained. The controlling ownership of Whitmore Collection would no longer pass directly into private hands. Instead, the company would transfer into a foundation structure after Eleanor's death, with a governing board and legal safeguards designed to preserve both the business and a public mission. A substantial percentage of annual profits would fund housing initiatives, elder care programs, and transitional support for women and families facing homelessness, abandonment, or financial collapse. Vivian and Celeste would not be cast out entirely. Eleanor was too deliberate for vindictive chaos. Each would receive a trust, comfortable, secure, but far from controlling. The terms were strict: philanthropic service hours, financial transparency, and no authority over the company's direction without board approval and demonstrated commitment to the foundation's mission. Celeste stared as if she had been physically struck. You cannot be serious.
I have never been more serious in my life. Vivian's voice turned cold and dangerously soft. You are handing a major hospitality group to someone who has never run so much as a regional branch. Naomi opened her mouth, but Eleanor answered first. I am not handing it to an amateur. I am investing it in the only daughter who understands what hospitality actually means. For one brief moment, something almost like pride flickered in Naomi's eyes, but it vanished quickly, replaced by restraint. She had not asked for this. Eleanor knew that, which was precisely why she trusted her. The argument went on for nearly an hour. Vivian threatened legal review. Celeste accused Naomi of manipulation. Naomi refused both martyrdom and triumph, insisting in a steady voice that if she took any role, it would be because she intended to do good with it, not because she wished to humiliate anyone. Eleanor listened, answered when necessary, and held the line where she had once retreated into pride or silence. At last, Vivian picked up her briefcase. If you proceed with this, she said, looking at Eleanor with chilling clarity, do not expect me to stand by and applaud your descent into sentimental madness. I am not asking for applause. I am asking you to look honestly at yourself. Whether you do that is no longer within my control. Celeste lingered a moment longer, eyes bright with fury and humiliation. You have chosen her over us. Eleanor met her gaze. No, I chose wrongly once. I am trying, very late, to stop doing so. When they were gone, the house seemed larger and emptier than before, but not colder. Naomi remained standing by the window for a while after the front door closed, her face unreadable. Eleanor did not push her. She had learned, finally, that love could not be forced into neat timing. At last, Naomi turned and said, You do realize they'll never forgive this easily. I know. And society will talk. Let it. Naomi looked at her for a long moment. Then something softened around her eyes. Not complete forgiveness, but something steadier than before. You always did hate being embarrassed. Yes, Eleanor said. Perhaps I'm overdue. The months that followed were brutal in some ways and unexpectedly hopeful in others. As Eleanor had predicted, the story did not remain private. Servants talked.
Lawyers noticed unusual clauses. Someone from Celeste's social circle heard half the tale, embellished the rest, and by spring there were whispers in London and along the Riviera about the Whitmore matriarch who had tested her daughters in disguise and discovered the outcast was the only one with a heart. Vivian loathed the scandal. Her husband, a barrister with political ambitions, found the story socially inconvenient, especially once one society columnist framed it as the inheritance revolt of a mother disgusted by decorative compassion. Celeste fared little better. The same friends who once praised her elegance now watched her too closely, as if wondering whether she would offer them tea or merely usher them toward the gate if misfortune ever changed their clothing. Eleanor did not enjoy their humiliation, but neither did she rescue them from it. For the first time, consequences were allowed to stand. Naomi's life changed more slowly and, to Eleanor's relief, more honestly. She did not move overnight into luxury. She refused 3 different houses Eleanor suggested and finally accepted only a modest but beautiful home near one of the older Whitmore properties in Yorkshire, a place large enough for Oliver to have his own room, close enough for school, and practical enough not to feel like costume. She left the pharmacy gradually rather than dramatically, spending the first year studying hospitality management, foundation governance, and property operations with the same quiet determination she had once given to surviving widowhood. Oliver changed too, though in simpler ways. He grew less watchful about money. He joined a school debate club. He stopped pretending not to want things. He and Eleanor developed an affection that never felt forced, shared toast on early Saturdays, patient card games, discussions about football and novels, arguments over marmalade thickness. Through him, Eleanor encountered the ordinary forms of family she had neglected while chasing legacy. Then came the project that made everything real. One of the Whitmore collection's earliest properties, a dignified but underused country house hotel that no longer performed well commercially, was selected for conversion, not into a vanity venture, not into branded charity for magazine spreads, into something Naomi designed with ruthless practicality and deep compassion. Whitmore House, a transitional residence for elderly women facing homelessness, isolation, financial abandonment, or displacement after widowhood, illness, or family estrangement. Naomi oversaw everything herself. She insisted the rooms be beautiful, not merely functional. If someone has lost everything, she told a skeptical architect, the least we can give her is dignity that doesn't look borrowed. She created reading rooms, warm kitchens, legal aid offices, counseling support, and job placement partnerships for women still able and eager to rebuild independent lives. Eleanor watched the work unfold with a kind of awe. Here was hospitality stripped of vanity and returned to its moral core. 2 years after the confrontation in the drawing room, the first Whitmore house was ready. By then, Eleanor's health had begun to decline. Age, long deferred by willpower, was finally making its claim. She tired more easily. Her hands ached in the mornings. There were days when stairs seemed steeper than they used to. Yet she was not lonely in the way she had once feared old age would be. Naomi visited often, sometimes with forgiveness visible, sometimes with old caution still present, but always real. Oliver sprawled in her sitting room after school and called out "Gran" so casually that the word no longer felt like an impossible mercy. Vivian and Celeste remained at varying distances. There were letters, one furious, one wounded, one unexpectedly reflective months later from Celeste after the collapse of a friendship circle she had once believed permanent. Eleanor answered both daughters with the same message: "My door is open when truth is." Not for performance, not for negotiation, for truth. Whether they would ever fully walk through that door, she did not know. But for the first time in many years, uncertainty no longer frightened her the way false peace once had. On the morning Whitmore House officially opened, the sky was clear and pale. The gardens trimmed, but not ostentatious. The old stone facade restored with grace rather than extravagance. A small crowd gathered. Local officials, staff, journalists, donors, neighbors, women from partner charities, and several elderly residents already chosen for the first intake. Naomi stood near the entrance in a dark green coat, elegant in a way that belonged entirely to herself. Oliver, taller now and trying very hard to seem grown up, stood at her side. Eleanor arrived slowly, leaning lightly on a cane she had recently begun to use, but with her head held high. As the ribbon was brought forward, cameras lifted. A hush moved through the crowd. Someone asked Eleanor whether she wished to speak. She looked at Naomi first. Naomi gave the smallest nod. So Eleanor stepped toward the microphone. Her voice, when it came, was not as strong as it had once been, but it carried. "For most of my life," she said, "I believed success could protect a family from becoming small-hearted. I was wrong. I believed obedience was the same thing as loyalty, that polish was the same thing as character, and that respectability was proof of moral worth. I was wrong about all of it." The crowd was silent. Eleanor continued. "Years ago, I cast out the daughter standing beside me because I judged the life she chose by the standards of pride and fear. I mistook love for weakness. I mistook class for virtue. And when I was finally forced to see which of my children still understood compassion, it was the one I had wounded most deeply who opened the door." Naomi's eyes filled, though she looked down to steady herself. Eleanor turned slightly toward her and said the last part not to the crowd, but to her daughter. "You did more than give a stranger a place to sleep. You gave your mother a final chance to become better than the woman she had been." Then she reached for the ceremonial scissors. Her hand shook too much to manage them alone. Without a word, Naomi stepped beside her and placed her hand over Eleanor's. Together, they cut the ribbon. Applause rose around them, but Eleanor barely heard it. What she felt instead was Naomi's hand still holding hers after the ribbon fell. Not out of obligation, not out of performance, but because somewhere over those painful years and harder reconciliations, forgiveness had ceased being a fantasy and become something living, imperfect, scarred, but real. And standing there between her daughter and grandson, in front of a house built to shelter those the world had made too easy to dismiss, Eleanor Whitmore understood at last what legacy truly meant. Not what one leaves behind in marble, brass, or balance sheets, but what one repairs before the end. And for the first time in longer than she could bear to measure, she felt that when her own final night came, she would not meet it as a woman abandoned by her family or haunted only by pride. She would meet it as a mother who had been wrong, admitted it, had changed, and had finally found her way home.